Lamis Deek, our awesome speaker. Lamis has an incredible bio, so much so that I'm only going to be saying about a third of it. Please read about her afterward if you don't know her. She's an amazing person whose footsteps we all follow in. She's a Palestinian attorney and a human rights advocate based in New York. She has a private practice where she has litigated Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim civil rights and criminal issues. She currently serves as the chief counsel to the Global Justice and Human Rights Law Network. She has been an advocate for Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim rights for nearly 2 decades. She is currently involved with the National Lawyers Guild, Al-Auda New York. She's a longtime member and is a critical member of that organization. She advises CARE New York, and she's the co-founder of the Popular Assembly of Palestinians in North America. Please help me welcome Lamis.
You know, I'm going to talk about the right to return, but I don't need to teach you about the law. Because you can do a Google search and find out everything you need to know about the right to return and international law and learn it in about 10 minutes. All of the foundations and frameworks are there. I think even Adala Justice Center has published about it, Badil has published about it. There's no shortage. That's not my goal to talk to you about international law and the right of return. My goal is really to center this and figure out what repivots we all need to make and what role the Palestinian right to return plays, not just for Palestinians, but actually really for the world. And I'd like to start a little bit where the last session left off. And bravery. You know, Dr. Abu Rashid is one of many Palestinians who've come under extreme attacks, as has Amir, as have, I'm sure, the other speakers in the room. I don't want to name you if you don't want to be named. So, you know, and I myself, I was just discussing with Dima a little bit about how we need to actually write down the tactics that Zionists and Israelis use to liquidate our movements and to silence us and scare us. And a lot of what you guys were discussing about what narrative is best and safest really stems from this, right? The very smart, tactical, and powerful forces and tactics that the Israelis and the Zionists use to censor us and to separate us from each other. You know, Dr. Abu Rashid, I have survived countless attacks from every sector of Israeli, Zionist, and even government society. And the key, as you've seen in many of the people, even Dr. Abu Rashid, who's under extreme pressure, but he still goes out and he does not change his narrative, and he goes and he flies and he travels and he talks about Palestine, as does Ahmed and Dima and Sandra and everybody else. Because there is a momentum and there's a really powerful psychological impact to really, whether you feel it or not, to articulate bravery. And you know, you can compare this to how we deal with Israeli soldiers at checkpoints, right? The minute that you engage from a position of power, they respond to that differently than when you engage from a position of weakness. And it's the same thing here in the United States. And I think that's important to take away. Let me tell you, I've been practicing as an attorney for over 15 years now. And I was maligned by Daniel Pipes from when I was in law school. I was one of the early people who was put on the equivalent of Canary Mission. Pamela Geller and her people used to follow me around in the streets to my home, to my neighborhood. And I still continued. And even when I went to courts, the judges and the other lawyers either thought of me as the terrorist lawyer or came up to me and said to me outside of the courtrooms, and I'm talking about judges, I really like what you do, you keep doing it. And even those judges who didn't appreciate or like my position on Palestine or the fact that I defended people who were accused of terrorism, well, they thought 10 times before they issued a decision in my cases because they knew that I was not afraid to fight back. So even the defamation of me, I used it, as many other lawyers have, as a shield and a sword to protect my clients in court. And that is the power of bravery. Was I always not scared? No. There are plenty times that I've been scared and I've been shaking, and I still do it the same way that our people and we do it when we go to Palestine and we stand at those checkpoints. But that is not what I'm really here to talk about. But I want you to keep that in mind as we're talking about the Palestinian right to return, because it really plays into everything else we should be doing at this very important juncture, not just in the Palestinian movement, but in the world globally. And that's why I'm happy to be here, right? We are at a time where we are watching the extreme polarization of the world, right? We are watching American and European fascists align themselves with neo-Nazis, align themselves with Zionists, and you know what? Zionists are Arab, they are Muslim, they are Christian, and they are Jewish, and all of these forces are aligning themselves, and they're letting the world know that they're unashamed in their intent to dominate the world by violence. And this is one pole that we're witnessing. More important for you and for us is the other pole that we're watching, right? The pole that got the resolution against Ilhan Omar pushed down. And that is the pole that is filled with young, energetic blood. Young, energetic blood that calls for the end of the degradation of the world's environment and climate, that calls for the protection of Black lives, that calls for clean drinking water, and that calls for the liberation of Palestine. And they align themselves and they see themselves, and in fact, they are the ones who are poised to save the world from itself. And at the very top of this pole, it is all of our job to make sure that it is Palestinian refugees and their right of return that mounts this. Not just because I'm Palestinian, no, but because we have, for the sake of the world, its stability and its peace, to center and prioritize Palestinian refugees and their repatriation to their original homes and lands. This is crucial. This is a force for global peace. And it is my goal to explain very briefly, why is it that if Palestinian refugees don't return to their original homes and lands, the world is not very safe, stable, or peaceful? First and foremost, what happens to the Palestinians is a precedent that can happen to anybody. If we make exception to human rights and humanity for one people, you can rest assured that without a doubt, that exception will be made for another people. If Palestinians can be made stateless and kept refugees, we, and I don't mean just us Palestinians, but the whole of the people of the world, can be rendered into refugeedom indefinitely. So carving out this exception for applying laws equally keeps people in danger. Number two, so long as Palestinians are left straddling the borders of their home country in one of the most geomilitarily strategic places on earth, a brewing cauldron of political grievances that will not be resolved by money but by law and justice, there will be no regional peace and there will be no regional stability, which means that there will be no world peace and there will be no world stability. Adding points 1 and 2, and a lot of what everybody else has talked about. Look at how critical the return of refugees is to what Dima's working on, what Sandra's working on, what Dr. Abu Rashid is working on. The only way that we can justify not implementing the Palestinian right to return and keeping Palestinians stateless is by perpetuating a narrative that justifies it, right? And that narrative has to say that somehow they are excluded from humanity, somehow they are subhuman and not worthy of human rights, which then means we have to perpetuate and sustain and support this narrative against people who are like Palestinians, whether physically, religiously, culturally, or ideologically. And so, by refusing to implement the Palestinian right to return, you perpetuate the anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, anti-MENA narrative that has been used to justify the domination and the exploitation and the violence and the war and the destruction of the MENA region. It is that direct a connection. Number 4, Israel is the most militarized society on earth. And it is through Israel's military technology and its technology of repression and surveillance that it maintains its global and diplomatic powers. And it justifies its militarization by, of course, falsely framing Palestinians as a threat against which it must develop its war technology and its military industry to defend itself, and to keep this sector, this critical sector of its political power, not just the economic, of its political power in the world and as a source of diplomacy, it has to keep it profitable. And to keep this sector profitable, it must export its products of violence. To export its products of violence, it must itself always be invested in war and upheaval and turmoil that necessitates the selling of technologies and weaponry. And so as we look at Venezuela, we could see Israeli troops lined up on the border of Venezuela, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Sudan, El Salvador. Wherever there was profit to be made, I got 5 minutes, I'm not gonna make it, sorry. You're gonna have to give me more time. Wherever there is profit to be made, you will find Israelis because they need that market. And these are the same technologies that are then developed and used against us here and against which we have to fight in the courtrooms. And the return of Palestinian refugees, this simple act, this safe, peaceful act, dismantles all of the justifications and all of the technologies and structures and institutions that justify maintaining Israel as the entity that it is. So when I say to this room that the return of Palestinian refugees is a force for global peace, it is neither poetic nor idealistic, but it is material reality. So knowing this information, what do we do? I think it's important that we assess the mistakes that we have made, because certainly Israel's military and geopolitical and diplomatic prowess is responsible for what we're facing, but we have to be honest about where we are. First and foremost, let's assess what's happened and who's done what. Since 2008, I think we can all agree that it has been Gaza who has been the cause of the mushrooming international solidarity movement in support of Palestine, which is why Ilhan, the resolution, did not pass, right? It began in Gaza, right? That's where it began. We must also be clear that in the past year, Gaza has made more progress and elevated the right of Palestinian return and refugees more than anybody has done for the past 40 years. And it wasn't the wealthy among the people of Gaza, because there are wealthy in the leadership of Gaza as well. It wasn't the wealthy or the children of the wealthy or the children who got contracts from phone companies, no. It was the children of the refugees and the fallahin who were going to the front lines to die in a theater of violence, which you can then use and say, look at our humanity and look at Israeli violence. We use them to prove our humanity to our neighbors here. So let us also be clear about that. It was Ibrahim Abu Suraya who used to clean windshields without any legs, right? Before the Israelis killed him again in the last Gaza return march, right? It was our people in the refugee camps in Syria and Lebanon who in May of 2008 ran from the refugee camps to the borders of Palestine to face Arab and Israeli bullets, trying to show the world how easy it is for Palestinians to walk back to their original homes and lands. And in this context, I mean, it's not just only on the killing fields of Gaza that we find the answer to Palestinian liberation and return, but in every aspect of Palestinian life. To give us some perspective about how great our people are, and I'm talking about the ones that are really great and that are not made great by dollars and offices and suits, the really great ones, how great they really are. For perspective, in 1 year, a few years back, the highest that the Palestinian GDP has ever been is $8 billion, the entire Palestinian gross domestic product, $8 billion. I think in 2012 or 13, it was $3.5 billion, the entire Palestinian GDP. In that same year, the Israeli military budget was $16.5 billion, not including direct military aid in the amount of $3.2 billion. The entire Palestinian GDP, 3.5. The military budget $19.7 billion. In that time, what have we seen Israel do? How many massacres and homes and communities has it destroyed? And in that time, what have Palestinians done? I'll tell you, in part, just what I know about that they've done. They've produced for the world some of the most sustainable and innovative agricultural technologies, from new farming technologies to new fishing technologies to new construction, organic, sustainable materials, to producing the cheapest, most easily producible stethoscope and the most accurate stethoscope on earth. This is what we did with $3.5 billion, and this didn't come from offices in towers in Ramallah or DC or in Gaza. So given this, given the greatness of our people, given their contribution to our welfare in this room, where we can prove our humanity, then we must ask, where are they in the political processes that speak for Palestinians? How many refugees in the refugee camps of Lebanon and Syria do you know are able to vote or run for office in any Palestinian institution? None. How many of you are able to vote in the Palestinian elections from here in the United States? Very few, if any. What mechanisms do we have to ensure that the greatness and the richness and the power of the Palestinian people is actually represented in the processes and the spaces and the halls of power, from the UN to Congress to, whatever's left of the PLO? Who is ensuring that these people who have both sacrificed the most and who know better than all of us what an ideal Palestinian society and liberation looks like, who are they being represented by? And why are they not on the table when we talk about them? That's number one. Number two, for at least 40 years, we have been relegating the Palestinian right to return in the context of negotiations to a footnote. We want to end the checkpoints. We want to get rid of the settlements. We want to swap land for peace. And ba'deen, in some undetermined future, we'll talk about the Palestinian right to return. This is the definition of insanity. There has been no conflict in the world has been resolved without first and foremost resolving the return of the refugees in the entire world, except for us. So this was a tremendous failure by all of us. I won't lay this just at the feet of the leadership who was operating in secret offices and trying to make deals before this faction and that faction comes into. It's on all of us. We are perfectly capable of, when people are presenting the two-state resolution or talking about peace in Palestine or talking about Hajj's Hiwara, no. We can't talk about any of this until we talk about the refugees, because without their return, none of us are safe and we will all become refugees, aside from the global importance of this. We must also look to prior successful models of liberation and refugee return, right? Because the Zionists tell you, Lamis, and they still say this, Lamis wants to throw all the Jews in the river. No, I don't. I'm not a monster and I'm not naturally violent. I have actual legal proposals for how this works. In fact, every other refugee population has used them. But I want to look first at the Algerian model. In its very last phase, right before Algeria was liberated, the Algerian resistance said that it would take a number of actions. Key among them was this, what we talked about now, right? Is they did not leave out a single Algerian or a single spot of Algerian land from their demands, unconditional demands for liberation. That was one decision they made. The other decision that they made was to pluck out what they called the Beni Oui of their community, the people who are the collaborators, the people who want contracts and goods and perks in exchange for cooperating with Israel, the civilized Arab, the Beni Oui, right? Those were very two key factors in securing the full liberation of the Algerian people. We're talking about the models. The other thing that we have to do is study the other models of refugee repatriation and look at them, and none of them have been perfect. Look at them. They're real. They're just a few years ago, whether it's South Africa or Guatemala or Bosnia, they're real. We have real models of repatriating Palestinian refugees, and we'll address this in the Q&A session. Let's look at them, and you know what? Let's make them better. Let's not repeat the mistakes of South Africa and Guatemala and Bosnia and the rest of them, right? Let's make those better. And we must, again, as I said initially, and I hold myself to this, right? Because it's not sufficient for me, and it's not fair for me, and it's a disservice to me and to you and to all of our people for me to say, hey, look at what the Zionists do to our people. It is not fair for me to prove my humanity at the expense and images of the bloodshed and the tears and the grief of our people in Palestine. And so the last thing that I would say we need to do is we need to recommit ourselves in a meaningful way, to understand that what we owe to our people in Palestine is what we owe to ourselves and to our future. Our people in Gaza, they don't go to the rallies expecting to come home every day. They do it for their children, and they do it even for us. It's an amani with which we are entrusted, right? They believe that maybe somebody will see and remember and preserve their right and exact justice even after they're dead, right? But we hold their images and we post them on Facebook, and it is not enough for us to elevate our people in their death. It must be our daily mission to elevate our people in life and before death reaches them, whether it's in the halls of power or in our economic transactions with each other. How do we financially support each other in a way that's not charity? How do we reintegrate them into our daily lives? Are we hiring Palestinian refugees in the camps? Right? So I want us to reimagine what it means to have an ideal Palestinian society and a truly unified, in practical terms, Palestinian people, all of which is indeed, without rhetoric or romance, the global force of peace. And I thank you.